From 10,000 feet, the water looks like hammered metal and the islands like emeralds. A reconnaissance pilot hums to keep his nerves steady as his camera slits blink and blink, each frame a slice of truth. He sweeps across Japan's inland sea on a clear morning in 1945, tracing the margins of coves in shipyards, the coves green as velvet. The fill will be rushed to a lab, dried with hot air, hung like laundry. In a room miles away, in a climate-controlled box of quiet, called an intelligence center, someone will slide those strips beneath the stereoscope and put on a pair of glass eyes that make flat photographs rear up in depth. He will lean close, and a forest will refuse to stay only a forest. In the middle of the trees, a line too straight appears, a shadow too crisp, a spline that curves like a hull. Then he finds the web, a grid of nets stretched from shore to shore, stitched with leaves, ratlins of bamboo, and rope holding an illusion in the air. Beneath the patchwork canopy, a battleship lies still as a trapped animal, breathing smoke you can't see. Across that water, under those nets, men in blue work pants carry armfuls of cut branches. Pine pitch brightens their hands. Needles shed like rain along the gangways. Every morning the foliage goes up. Every evening it wilts, and the next day they cut more. They lash the boughs to mesh with cord the color of bark. They build the forest they live under the same way a coral builds a reef. Patient, repetitive, infinite. The deck they walk on is a city a tangle of capstans and fairleads and turrets that can throw a projectile the weight of a car farther than a horizon. But from above, if they do it right, their city becomes a hillside. Gun barrels look like tree trunks. Superstructures dissolve into the green and brown of a shoreline that is not there. By 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy has learned a hard arithmetic. Once the sea belonged to the Navy that controlled the sky. Now, the sky belongs to an enemy who can appear without warning. In 1941, battleships and carriers were empires floating, their flags arrogant in wind. In 1945, their mass makes them targets. They drink fuel Japan cannot supply. They cannot be risked without a reason that feels like destiny. So they are hidden, not in caves, with a few exceptions where small craft find rock to swallow them, but in plain sight, rewritten as landscape. It sounds like a trick from a children's book. Hide a fleet in a forest. It is, in fact, a culture of survival. The Seto Inland Sea is a maze of water and mountains, a watercolor of inlets and islands so close that bridges, when they come in peacetime, will string them together like beads. The slopes are crowded with trees. Villages cling to coves that smell of resin and salt. Shipyards at Kure, Sasebo, Sasebo's sister ports, places that build and repair steel giants, are ringed by ridges that cast long shadows. In that geography, a plan takes shape. Anchor the big ships near shore where nets can tie to land. Paint decks and roofs not gray but green. Throw camouflage across mast and crane. Plant a forest in the air. Make the mountains reach out their leaves over the sea. The eye is clever. The eye is easy to lie to. From above, the world is a map, and maps obey cleanness. The Japanese camouflage teams exploit that neatness. They study how reconnaissance works, what angles give pilots and cameras the most detail, when sun glints betray shapes, how a mast shadow can betray a ship. They build frames of bamboo and steel pipe. They soak hemp in dye. They hack evergreen branches and palm fronds and drag them into place where the sea licks at the leaves, and the leaves look no different from the slope behind them. Engineers design smoke generators to cloud the bays at the rumble of enemy engines. Shore batteries hide under the same masquerade, their muzzles cut with fern-smelling disguise. Anti-aircraft guns sprout like aggressive shrubs. A continent away, analysts will look at those photographs and argue, trees or turrets? A navy is a doctrine made into metal. Japan's doctrine had always promised a decisive battle, draw the enemy west, hit him at night and close, drown him in a geometry of long guns and torpedoes. After Midway, that promise is harder to keep. After the Philippine Sea, harder still. Surface ships that were supposed to be queens of the board become pieces hoarded under tables, saved for some last roll of dice. In between, they must be not found. There is no glamour in that task, no music. There is work. Haul, tie, mask, mend, the hours in the shade of a false wood. Sailors who once trained to adjust a bearing by feel, now judge how much green is enough by squint. The Americans have hours, then days, then years of looking from above. They build their own doctrine. No sanctuaries under sky. They will bomb shipyards, bridges, rails, piers hit where steel is born, where it is repaired, where it hides. When B-29s begin to range over the home islands, the war changes for civilians and sailors alike. The big bombers love altitude. Their horizon is the curvature of the earth. But the eyes that feed them and the carriers that prowl closer will have to tease out difference where difference has been rubbed smooth. A forest is a cloaking device when the enemy needs you to look quickly and move on. The men under the camouflage nets bet their lives on speed and assumption. They do not need to be invisible forever. They need to be invisible long enough. If we call this a secret mission, it is because it hides in the ditch between two kinds of war, the photographed and the lived. In the photograph, you see texture the bamboo grids and the dapple of leaves that seem to lick the edge of the water. In the lived, you hear the creak of a battleship's hull settling against its moorings at flood tide, the thump of boots and the rasp of rope, the breath of men hauling brush until their muscles burn. You hear rumors of a carrier that painted its flight deck green to look like an airfield when viewed from the edge of a cloud, of a cruiser that tucked itself under a cove's lip and wore a roof of vines, of a seaplane base that became a forest every morning by sheer force of will. As the radio nets hum on both sides of an ocean, a spy listens for words that betray position. As codebreakers trawl ciphers, aerial eyes crisscross the inland sea. As shipyards hammer steel, crews sharpen axes. In the last year of the war, Japan's last heavy ships, some proud, some battered, all fat with significance, will spend long weeks pretending to be hills. The question is as stark as any battlefield pose. Will it be enough? The answer is as complicated as a canopy, sometimes for a while. It begins with an inheritance. Before there were carriers and radar and the long reach of four-engine bombers, navies learned to hide from eyes on the water. Dazzle patterns tried to make a hull lie to a periscope. Smoke screens could dress a retreat as a storm. Shallow coves could turn an armada into a rumor. But the Second World War took the observer out of the salt spray and put him into the cold light of high noon. Airpower turned seas into floors that could be walked over. You could no longer hide by curving a wake or by outrunning a horizon. You had to rewrite the horizon itself. Japan understood this as both student and teacher. In 1941 and 1942, Imperial carriers proved the sky's tyranny at Pearl Harbor. In the Java Sea, over the Indian Ocean, they made the British Navy look old. They taught the world to fear the shadow of a torpedo bomber's wing. But by 1943 and 1944, the United States had built a machine that Japan could not answer. Production, fuel, flight training, radar, code breaking, the patient art of logistics. The United States had more of each. The Pacific became a proving ground for the idea that you win wars by forcing the other side to show itself, and then punishing it before it can move. For a navy raised on the doctrine of the decisive battle, concealment looked like discipline. If you cannot win in motion, you wait in ambush. For that, geography is mercy. The Seto Inland Sea is a marvel, a lattice of channels that lace through mountains. A place where mist rises in winter and tree shadows scribble across water in summer. The cities that ring it, Kagoshima, Sasebo, Sasebo's neighbors, were natural homes for an industrial navy. They were also accidental allies for a strategy of hiding. High ground close to shore is a camouflage artist's best friend. Camouflage is not only paint, it is an ecosystem. At Kure, ship fitters and carpenters, who once built superstructures, turned to building frames meant to carry fabric and foliage. The technique evolved across the war's years, like a species adapting. Early on, flight decks took on green splotches that imitated airstrips when anchored near shore. Photographs show Japanese carriers in 1942-43 with dark green modeling laid hastily over wooden planks. Ashore, dummy planes spouted in rows that lured bombers. In lagoons at Truk and Palau, small ships nested beneath overhangs where jungle leaned outward like a sheltering hand. Nets were stretched from stump to stump, from mast to pier, weighted with branches to break hard lines into a painter's soft strokes. Truk Lagoon to those who lived there taught hard lessons. In February 1944, the U.S. fleet arrived with a storm in its hands. Operation Hailstone blanketed Truk with strike after strike. Japanese ships ran or tried to, or sought to vanish against the shoreline. Some didn't move at all, beached, anchored, resigning themselves to becoming parts of the island chain. Camouflage helped in handfuls. A freighter under a cliff disguised by netting survived one raid, only to die in the next. A fuel depot masked with coconut fronds lasted a day longer than its neighbor. The larger picture was brutal. With air supremacy and patient reconnaissance, Americans hit, left, and returned. After Truk, the logic of hiding grew more domestic home islands, inland seas, harbors that could be made into theater sets of stone and green. On the far edge of the Philippines, at Tawi-Tawi in the Sulu archipelago, the Japanese fleet gathered in 1944 in a mangrove world. The anchorage was a lacework of channels walled by trees. There, too, the instinct was to let the environment do the work. Smoke pots and natural cover made a harbor into a maze of smudged lines. Submarines peered in and saw silhouettes. Shore batteries were hard to read against living shade. But the Allied planes came anyway, and Japanese commanders knew the truth. A hiding place is not invincible. It is a bargain. It buys days. The bargain became doctrine, not by proclamation, but by habit. The big ships, especially after 1944's defeats, became too valuable to waste and too expensive to use. Fuel shrank to a strategic luxury. Japan's synthetic oil program lagged behind necessity. Merchant tonnage bled in the Philippine Sea and along the China coast. Every sortie by a battleship cost not just risk and steel, but the fuel that might move 10 destroyers or keep a convoy afloat. So the battleships waited. Yamato and Musashi, emperors of steel, spent long periods swinging at anchor in sheltered water. Truk, Linga near Singapore, the Inland Sea near Kure, while watching the war approach. When they were moored, they exchanged their cloaks of gray for coats of green and brown and shadow. The technique hardened. Nets no longer meant just rope. They meant architecture. Bamboo grew in abundance. It made perfect ribs for a canopy. Sailors erected scaffolds that arced over decks, poles lashed into arches, lines drawn taut to shore. Leaves gave the texture depth. Paint gave it tone. Horizontal surfaces, turrets, roofs were daubed in green so bright, in some cases, that peacetime photos of museum models look almost playful. Up close, it was ugly. From the sky, it was continuity. The hillside ran without a seam out over the water, a smooth line that begged the camera's eye to slide past. Elsewhere, in Palau in March 1944, Operation Desecrate, one showed what could and could not be hidden. The Rock Islands are a natural camouflage school. Their undercut shapes offer coves that seem purpose-built for deception. The Japanese used them. Barges and patrol boats tucked tight under the mushroom caps. Seaplanes rested in greenery that tangled with their wings. Yet photographs taken after the raids show the limits. Nets shredded, moorings cut, ships flattened by bombs that were aimed through flak and guesswork, then corrected the next day with better images. Across the Pacific, in Hawaii, in a gray building near Pearl Harbor, the Joint Intelligence Center, Pacific Ocean Areas, JICPOA trained analysts to see through all that cleverness. The men and women there learned to read tone, texture, context. A net can hide a line. It cannot hide a wake. A forest canopy cannot hide a ready-use ammunition locker hauled onto a pier. A row of trees throws peculiar shadows if the leaves are tied to wire. The analysts paired stereoscopic images and cross-referenced them with interception reports, pilot debriefs, prisoner interrogations. They learned the breath rhythm of a harbor, the way cranes congregated where work was worth doing, and the way smoke lingered in the wrong place. And so the race continued. The inland seas, forests, and nets bought hours, days, sometimes weeks. Allied eyes adapted. The war's line moved closer to the home islands. Carriers prowled the coast now. B-29s traced an iron circle over cities. Tokyo burned. Hiroshima and Nagasaki would fall late with a new kind of fire. But before that new horizon, the old question kept returning to the water. Could the last battleships survive long enough under their borrowed leaves to matter? If you step onto a camouflage deck, the first surprise is the smell. Pitch and sap mingled with oil. Green sourness sitting over hot steel. Sailors call it their forest. The nickname feels like bravado and resignation both. Their ship once wore a uniform that boasted of power. Now it wears costume. But costume has its rituals, and rituals make meaning. Take a morning on a hybrid battleship, one of the old queens with her aft turrets replaced by catapults and a flat, peculiar deck for floatplanes. Post-Midway improvisation has made her something between eras. She lies in the inland sea, moored inside a cove that could be a painting if not for the undercut of fear. Reveille comes with the gulls. Men stumble up ladders, and in addition to the ordinary duties of a ship, valves, pumps, watch bills, scrape and paint, there is the garden. Working parties go ashore with axes and saws and come back bent under boughs. They replenish what yesterday's sun has tired. Others unroll netting like fishermen. The master-at-arms checks that camouflage discipline is strict. No slack lines. No glints of metal. No carelessness with the color of a box left on a deck, some bright tin the eye loves. They plant their forest. The crew grumbles because they would rather fire guns than tie knots, because the sap sticks to everything, because the camouflage burns their arms when they brush against it. They grumble and keep working. Ashore, camouflage companies haul supplies into sheds that used to hold spare parts. Bamboo arrives in wagon loads, cut to length and bundled. Dyeing vats bubble like soups. Net makers stitch squares with fingers that know the measure of a handspan without looking. An officer with a sketchbook studies the slope of the nearest mountain and translates it into angles and color patches his sailors can reproduce. Smoke canisters line the piers disguised as piles of lumber. It is theater, yes, but theater disciplined by the knowledge that the audience drops bombs. Pilots and photo interpreters learn a different theater. They practice looking without believing their first impression. At forward carrier bases and on island runways, reconnaissance pilots brief with maps marked with tiny symbols where a hull might be. But isn't allowed to be a hull yet, not until a second lens says so. They are told to fly not majestically broad, but precise, along sun lines, across them, low once and high twice. Their cameras are farm tools, brutal and simple. They bring back two things, images and judgment. Back at JICPOA or at a fleet intelligence tent, pitching over with wind, a lieutenant with headaches will lay two photographs side by side and feel the terrain click into 3 dimensions under his stereoscope. He will slide his pencil along the canopy line and feel it catch there. See it? See where the net sags and touches the curve of a turret? See the repetitive rhythm that leaves never keep? And on the water near the trees, a tugboat wake. Why is a tugboat here, right next to a hillside? Why is there a line of floats leading under the canopy, like beads mooring points each exactly 60 feet apart? Forests don't need mooring buoys. The cat and mouse develops its own craft language. Sailors speak of their hill, meaning the shape they have trained their canopy to imitate. Our hill runs long on the port side, a petty officer jokes, meaning the net is tighter forward than aft. Pilots tell one another to look for square shadows. Regularity is the enemy of life. Camouflage officers become scientists of leaf droop and light scatter. They experiment with coatings that make netting less reflective, with patterns that break mast gaps into tree breaks and not linear holes the eye finds satisfying. Sometimes they pour sand over tarps and water it to make the color richer. They discover, like gardeners, which plants last longest once cut. In summer, pine can hold its vigor for 2 days. In rain, the canopy swells and sags, and ropes groan. There is ingenuity, and there is farce. Dummy ships appear in peacetime histories. They look like ships made by children from crates. Barges lashed together, plywood bows, poles for masts, smudged with paint, and topped with a lattice of green. They float in anchorages, a channel over, and drink down bombs meant for something else. Decoys take many forms. A set of frames in a stripped dry dock crowned with brush. Lights at night that imitate a shipyard working late. Torpedo boat pens that pretend to be cliff faces from the air. In the Philippines and in the Marshalls, American pilots bomb fake airfields and then add them to their lexicon of deceptions they will not fall for twice. In Japan, the camouflage gets subtler because it has to. The enemy is close now, and their patience has grown. And yet there are days when the canopy wins. A carrier group prowls off Shikoku, launches strikes and sheets of noise. The pilots scream through flak they describe later as black flowers, as if language is tired and wants to be pretty for a second. They break out over Kure and see water full of shadows that belong to cranes, slips, piers, smokestacks. They see hills. They see a grove that looks too perfect, as if a child drew it rounded tops, each the same size. The first bombs go into fields and splash in water. Then the gunners on the hills open fire, and the hills ripple in a way hills do not. There are gun flashes where no gun should be. The pilots look harder. The hills shift in their eyes and become ships. On later photos, you can trace the learning curve. Early strikes waste weight on nets and air. Later strikes thread panels through the canopy to touch steel. Elsewhere, at Palau, a patrol plane creeps along the edge of the rock islands and photographs coves that look like caves of leaves. On the Prince, you see only green. On the obliques taken late, when the sun glances off an angle the netting cannot handle, you see a seam of gray. A motor vessel crouches under the overhang, camouflaged so well that it confuses the eye until the evidence accumulates. That word, accumulates, defines the counter. No single photograph cancels a clever lie. A stack of them, layered over days, does. In a diary, you cannot read because it burned. A petty officer on Haruna would have complained about splinters from bamboo and sap that would not leave his hands. In an after-action report, you can read because it was copied again and again. A dive bomber pilot describes dropping through a grove of trees that spat fire, and only as he pulled up did he realize he had flown through the mesh over a battleship SF deck, his bombs falling with the sound of tearing canvas. The canopy did not stop him. It dared him to aim wrong. It made him take a second look. He lived long enough to write about it because others took longer. Summer 1945 drips heat. The inland sea is a mirror with a migraine. Ripples and quivers where wakes disappear into netting. The carriers of Task Force 38 arrive like a weather front. The Americans are not guessing anymore. They have photographs that have been argued over, annotated, believed. They have reports from submarines who counted masts at dawn while peering through scope crosshairs at shadowed bays. They have radio intercepts that hint at ships laid up for lack of fuel, at crews spread thin, at all the stoicism of men told to be still when they are mostly waiting. On July 24th, the first great blow falls. The strikes go for the shipyards and the capital ships both. Kure, Yokosuka, Maizuru. The inland sea's tight corners or harbor water becomes a playing field. The scene is all motion and all horror. Helldivers and avengers lean into their dives. Flak pulls black threads through sky. Ships under the canopies erupt in flashes. Battleship Haruna, moored near Kure, draws attention like a curse. She is old and proud, and renamed by some of her enemies in their mission talk, a floating fortress. Her canopy quivers with the wind of passing aircraft. The pilots have been told what to look for: the unnatural symmetry in the greenery, the straightness under curves. They put 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs where steel matters. The camouflage catches fire and burns like a grove that suddenly remembers it is on a sea. The ship settles. She does not go quickly. She resists, like a house that refuses to lean, even as the foundation erodes. By July 28th, repeated strikes guarantee the end. She sinks at her mooring in shallow water, decks just beneath the surface, masts like stripped trees reaching up. Nearby, the hybrid battleships Eyes and Hugo once gun-bristling symbols, rebuilt after Midway to carry floatplanes in a last hope of relevances under their own green roofs. The green buys them minutes, not salvation. Bombs punch through and detonate where armor is thin or where previous repairs have left vulnerabilities. The decks that look like lawns from above buckle. Fires eat the canopy, and then eat the ship. They will not leave these coves again. Before the week ends, they are settled to the bottom in the inland sea, defiant and done. The carriers suffer their own humiliations. Amagi, hiding at Kure, wears a forest as well as any, and still cannot dodge the mathematics of altitude and speed. Her list becomes a lean. Her lean becomes a capsize. In photographs after the surrender, she lies like a grounded leviathan, flight deck bitten by bombs, her profile ragged. Katsuragi, less damaged, will survive to be scrapped. The greenery that once covered her decks turned to soot and mud. At Yokosuka, the veteran carrier Hosho sits under netting like a relic in a reliquary. She is spared heavy damage, a kind of respect or simply the accident of targeting at a sky too busy to be sentimental. Every ship has a story. Every story up to this point has a canopy seen leaves burning off like secrets. Between the 24th and the 28th, the Americans come again and again. They learn as they go. They realize that bombing through netting asks for narrow aim and a steady heart. They train themselves to trust the telltale signs on approach. The canopy throws up illusions, shadow shifts, weird flares when the sun feels like a searchlight, but practice replaces the panic that illusions are built to induce. The fantasy of the forest is overwhelmed by the reality that a target can be hit again tomorrow. In April, months earlier, the biggest ship of all had made her own decision to leave the trees. Yamato's last sortie operation, Tengo, was a death sentence signed by duty. There was no camouflage in open water. The canopy stayed behind, and she tore herself clean for the last time. American carrier pilots killed her with bombs and torpedoes south of Kyushu until she rolled and exploded, taking most of her crew. For sailors in the inland sea, the news was a lesson. Hiding had kept Yamato safe. Moving killed her. They stayed put, relashed their nets, cut more branches. They waited for the war to decide that waiting had been a form of fighting. There were moments of ingenuity amid ruin. Smoke generators on shore coughed and filled the coves with white so thick it tasted chalky. Signal flags flickered instructions to tugboats to shift ships under cover as best they could. When a canopy caught fire, crews yanked down the burning parts and replaced them even as sirens wailed for the next strike. On the American side, tactics shifted. Skip bombing at low level where nets could be a hazard, then high-angle armor piercers with delayed fuses to punish what nets could not defend. Fighter bombers strafed flak pits whose camouflage had grown sloppy after too many hot days. The fight above the forests was not abstract. It had weight, bodies, branches, steel, smoke. And then it was over, not with a cheer, but with a long sigh that lasted weeks. The inland sea, once a protected world inside a nation at war, filled with wrecks and shrapnel and a silence that felt stunned. The nets turned to garbage that sank or drifted ashore. The branches rotted in eddies. At Kure and Sasebo, shipyard workers poked through debris for tools and parts that could be used to mend roofs instead of hulls. Men walked the shallows on their day off and stared at a familiar line of islands now changed forever by those half-sunken shapes. The steel hills that had once pretended to be green hills pretended to be steel hills again. What had the forests bought? Time. A month here, a week there. A chance that a crew would eat together one more time. A chance that guns would be remounted, boilers retubed, ammunition delivered, men trained, some final order rescinded or rewritten. For some, it bought the illusion that home might be spared if the ships looked like home. For others, it bought a sense of control. If you can't decide the fate of your ship, you can at least decide how convincing your canopy will be. For the Americans, it bought a different lesson, that an enemy will draw on his landscape as if it is a resource, and that the landscape becomes part of the order of battle. In the first months after the surrender, the canopies are gone. The trees are only trees again, and winter strips them of their leaves. The inland sea looks like a map of a war anyone can now trace, because the secrets have been converted to salvage. Salvage companies swarm the shallows at Kure. Divers cut steel into shapes that tugboats can manage. The battleships that once wore forests or hats are rendered down, turned back into the raw substance of post-war life. Girders for bridges, plate for fishing boats, pillars for factories. It is a kind of reincarnation that makes the word peacetime feel real. The forests that hid them regrow each spring without needing cutting parties and rope and orders. They cover slopes that look down at the same water and see only fishermen wakes and ferry lines. The lie of a canopy did not change the land beneath it. The story of how Japan hid its battleships in forests survives in a handful of photographs and in the muscle memory of the men who tended those canopies. Aerial shots where a green blur in the corner turns, under the analyst's pencil, into a shape annotated BB. Photographs taken by tourists in the 1950s and 60s of harbors where nothing monstrous remains, only shrubs creeping back over concrete. A faded sketch in the back pages of a veteran's notebook showing how to lash bamboo ribs into a dome that would arc over a turret without catching on any of its fittings. For intelligence historians, it lives in footnotes that honor the quiet war between Camouflage and Reconnaissance, the duel between JICPOA's analysts and the camouflage officers at Kure. For the rest of us, it is an image. Leaves moving on salt water, the mind tricked into seeing hillside where there is hull. Was it foolish, desperate? Both, and something else, rational. When movement means death and fighting, means sacrifice without the chance of victory, hiding becomes a form of duty. A navy is an institution made of pride and habit. Training a sailor to sweep decks and polish brass is training him to pretend nothing changes. To ask that sailor to spend his days building and repairing a disguise is to change his war. Yet he does it because his friends' lives depend on how well his knots hold. Pride is malleable when fear is honest. In crowded quarters under a melting canopy, pride turns into competence. Competence, multiplied by hundreds of hands, becomes camouflage that first confuses, then compels respect briefly. For the Americans, the lesson was not simply how to see through a net. It was how to never trust a single source, how to build certainty out of multiple kinds of doubt. A stereoscope and a signal intercept, a pilot's impression and a wake line, a hunch and a second pass together, they make a target where a forest tried to be a shield. The method outlived the war. In conflicts that followed, analysts learned to look for what camouflage cannot hide: logistics. You can disguise a tank as a shed. You cannot hide the fuel it needs. You can roof a ship with leaves. You cannot hide the tugs and barges that serve it. Camouflage is a story you tell the eye. Intelligence is a conversation you have with the world until the contradictions resolve. There is also tenderness in the memory. Think of the sailor standing knee-deep in needles, lifting his head at the sound of engines, and seeing, for the first time in his life, an American carrier wing in motion. He knows the canopy won't matter now, not to this many planes. Still, he scans his lines. He looks for slack, for shine, for error he can correct with his hands. It is not theater anymore. It is hope standing up in the face of proof. On another deck, a young pilot sees trees rip open and guns glint. He experienced the reversal. The landscape that was supposed to be scenery becomes an actor with a weapon. He adjusts his aim down 5 feet. He has trained for this moment and also never imagined this exact shape. War is never what you expect. It is always what the other side can make you see. Walk today along the piers at Kure, where museums cradle fragments of that past. In glass cases, there are models that show netting like woven fog. On placards, dates that feel at once near and impossibly old. July 24th, July 28th, 1945. Elsewhere, on the water, ferries draw arcs between islands that used to hide destroyers. The Seto Inland Sea is as beautiful as any body of water on Earth. Its forests are gentler now than the ones sailors built. They have wind instead of orders. They move to the rhythm of seasons instead of alerts. But if you tilt your head a certain way, you can imagine a lattice of bamboo holding up a borrowed hillside over steel. You can imagine dropping into that world through flak and terror. You could imagine hands tying knots in the dark, a superstructure that looks like a tree line, a battleship that would rather be a mountain. The phrase, "hide a battleship in a forest," sounds like a parable for impossible tasks. In the end, it was neither absurd nor triumph. It was a technique, a habit, a month's grace. It did not save the ships in the long run. Nothing could not against the United States industrial tide, and the sky becoming a weapon that did not tire. But it mattered in human time. It let thousands breathe longer. It gave commanders choices in days when there were too few of those. It offered the odd dignity of craft to sailors who could no longer fight as they had trained. It left behind a lesson in humility. A war is not won only by those who charge, but also by those who watch, who interpret, who deceive, who build, who repair. If there is a call to take from this shadowed corner of the Pacific War, it is to look harder. Look harder at photos before you decide what you see. Look harder at stories that seem neat. Look harder at the labor inside any illusion. In any age, someone will try to hide a powerful thing in plain sight. The duty of citizens, the duty of minds trained by history, is to see the net under the leaves, the wake under the forest, the straight line under the curve. The men who made hills out of ships, and the men who saw through those hills were, in their way, trying to master the same opponent, perception. Their contest ended where all fights do in compromise and rubble, and finally, in peace. The forests they made went back to being forests. The ships they hid went back to iron, and then to memories. The water never changed its mind. It just kept moving, washing past pilings, where rope once cinched a lid of leaves over a deck, and where today a child might. lean out and trail a hand, not knowing that once a battleship slept beneath a roof of green, pretending to be part of the land.